Can you hear me and see me? I'm going to take that as a yes. Thank you, Idan, our tech director, for making sure that technology allows me to stream into our social hall. I'm really so sorry that I'm not with you in person today. I'm feeling pretty good. I was zapped by the COVID bug about a week ago. I tested positive last Thursday for the first time. I was down for the count for most of the weekend. I turned a corner on Monday. I've been feeling pretty good since Monday. A little congestion, a little fatigue, but not nearly like what it was a week ago. Unfortunately, I'm still testing positive. That could just be residual, but out of an abundance of caution, I'm here, you're there, and I hope that everybody remains safe and healthy. I especially want to express my thanks to the leadership of the WRJ, to Program Director Lori Bernstein, and especially to our fearless leader, Fran Scheffler-Siegel, for arranging the program for today's spring luncheon. And I'm especially grateful to them for their flexibility, because the subject that we're going to engage this afternoon is not the originally scheduled topic. Originally, I had proposed that we would have a nice, relaxing schmooze about the changing face of the rabbinate. We will have time for that conversation another day. The changing face of the rabbinate will be evident in anyone who is closely observing the changes in the faces of the rabbis at Westchester Reform Temple. So let me put in an extra little plug to come tomorrow evening to our Friday night Shabbat service at 6:15 p.m. It is scheduled to be held outdoors in the tent in lovely weather. And we will say thank you and farewell to Rabbi Levy, who has been with WRT for 10 years, and to Rabbi Reeser, who has been with WRT for 6 years. And both of them together have contributed immeasurably to the well-being of our congregation, and particularly over the last 2 years, have helped us all bear up under an extraordinarily stressful time. So our gratitude is owed to them, and I know that it will be meaningful for you to show up and express it personally through your presence and your love. So with that in mind, I'd also like to introduce Sharon Stiefel. Sharon began working at Westchester Reform Temple in December after the exciting news that WRT would be able to hire a full-time director of social impact and community engagement, somebody who would oversee the way in which we engage our congregation, and especially would help us bring tikkun olam, the repair of the world, one of the 5 pillars of WRT, the pursuit of justice and social action, to the forefront of all of our work. So Sharon joined us in December. I got to know her a little bit during the interview process and a little bit when she started working. I was grateful to enjoy 3 months of winter sabbatical time, where I did a little bit of travel and a lot of study and a lot of, I would call it, extracurricular leadership. And then I returned on the 1st of April to find that Sharon had already made her presence known and had already gotten hard at work enriching the fabric of WRT through her work. So Sharon, you want to say hi to the nice people out there?
Hi, everyone. I also apologize. I had planned to be there today, but my daughter, whose head is, yep, there she is quarantined again for COVID exposure. So I am here, but I'm so happy to be here. And I thank all of you for reaching out to me in different ways. And I also thank all of you for pivoting, which we've learned to do very well in the last 2 years, but pivoting to allow for this conversation to happen today. It is so truly important for us as a community to really come together and learn about why this is all a part of our Jewish values. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon. It's really wonderful to have you not just here, as it were, on this conversation, but to have you here at WRT doing our work together is really rewarding. And some of you are already observing the impact of having Sharon on the team, her expertise in the directions of social justice, her background in law, and her familiarity with how synagogues work, being a very dedicated member and volunteer leader at her own synagogue, Temple Beth El of Northern Westchester in Chappaqua, are already enriching WRT immeasurably. In fact, Sharon told me yesterday that you're chairing your temple's gala on Saturday night on top of everything else that you have going on at WRT.
That's correct. I'll be at WRT Friday night for services and then Bethel Saturday night for the gala.
Wow, good luck. So we may have an opportunity to hear a little bit more from Sharon later on. I'd like to introduce our topic this afternoon and go into our presentation. The topic is Jewish views on abortion, of course, one of the most controversial and complicated issues of our time. And as with most matters of public importance, Judaism brings its voice to the conversation. I want to make it clear that this is not a political talk by design or intent. This is a Jewish talk. We will speak in the language of Jewish texts and Jewish values and Jewish tradition. That does not mean that it has no bearing on the current political conversations around abortion in the United States of America. It most certainly does. Those who would wish for Judaism to be the thing that happens in synagogue and nowhere else find themselves sadly mistaken. Judaism is a way of looking at the world, a way of responding to the world. That means Judaism pertains to what we do in the synagogue, what we do online in and out of the synagogue. It pertains to how we live in our homes. So Judaism is very much a religion that cares about domestic life, about the family unit, about teaching children and honoring parents. This we know. But Judaism is, I would say, first and foremost, and above all else, a tradition that is brought to bear on how we conduct our public lives, how we organize ourselves in community, and how we behave, as it were, in the streets, in our places of work, in our civic responsibilities to our neighborhood, community, and nation, and global community. All of this, Judaism places not as a kind of sidebar to its considerations, but rather at the very center of its considerations. And inasmuch as politics refers to the domain in which public life is conducted and discussed, I'll say it again, politics is the domain in which public life is conducted and discussed, politics coming, of course, from Greek polis, meaning the public, the polity. If that is what politics is, then Judaism is most certainly a political tradition. Having said that, of the two of us, so sorry, I'm going to decline that phone call. Of the two of us, Sharon and me, only one of us is a rabbi and only one of us is a lawyer. So if you want to know the ins and outs of how the Jewish conversation might be brought to bear on the political conversation, how we might use our activism and become more familiar with the legal underpinnings of Roe v. Wade and the draft opinion authored by Justice Alito that was leaked a few weeks ago, that's actually in Sharon Stiefel's domain of expertise. My domain of expertise is in understanding Jewish tradition, Jewish law, and Jewish text. And that's what I hope to bring to you for the preponderance of our time together this afternoon. I'd like, however, to defer the first words in our conversation to my dear friend, colleague, and mentor, Rabbi Stern. Now, I refer to not Rabbi Stern, the elder, Jack Stern of blessed memory, who led our congregation for almost 30 years in the capacity of senior rabbi from 1962 till his retirement in 1991. And yes, I was blessed to know Jack for the last 8 years of his life. So from when I came to WRT in 2003 until his death in 2011, Jack was a part of my life. He was a mentor to me. He was a guiding presence and a very, very loving and cherished friend. I feel so richly blessed that I got to know Rabbi Jack Stern, as many of you got to know Rabbi Jack Stern, and maybe he even stood with you in moments of celebration or moments of bereavement or all the other moments of living your Jewish journeys here at WRT. Rabbi Stern has 3 wonderful children. Rabbi Stern, and I should say the late Priscilla Rudin Stern, his beloved wife, also of blessed memory. There's Jonathan, who's a lawyer based in DC. There's Elsie, who is a professor of Hebrew Bible at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Philadelphia, and who is currently one of the lead authors and editors of a brand new, just recently formed commission to create a new Reform Movement Torah commentary, so I was on the phone with both Elsie and their third child. I guess Elsie's the baby, but their middle child, David Stern, who is the rabbi of Temple Emmanuel of Dallas, which is the largest Jewish congregation in the Southwest of the United States, a wonderful friend, mentor, and rabbi in every way. So we're going to hear from Rabbi David Stern, who back in September preached a sermon for his congregation, Temple Emmanuel, on the subject of State Bill 8, SB 8, which was introduced at the time and then passed in the Texas legislature, the Texas state legislature. It is the case law which has become prominent in conversations ever since September on the subject of abortion, and only recently overshadowed by the leaked draft opinion from the Supreme Court of the United States. In this powerful sermon, October 22nd, Rabbi Stern speaks about SB 8 and the new laws affecting Texas women. As you will hear, this is a message rooted in Jewish tradition and value, and it contains strong calls to action to our community and reminders of how Jewish law and the Torah not only can, but must shape our views and our public discussions on these topics. So let's hear a little bit from Rabbi Stern. We won't hear the whole sermon, but we'll hear enough of it for you to follow his logic. And that will actually be the set induction, the opening piece of our conversation this afternoon. So I'm going to bring him up on screen. There he is. If you only ever knew what Rabbi Jack Stern of blessed memory looked like, you definitely see some resemblance in his son, David. There was a conference where Rabbi Stern was attending in his previous role as the volunteer president of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. That's my organizing rabbinical association. His foot was in a boot from some recent foot surgery, and he gets up on the podium and he says, well, every morning when I get up and I pray to God to make me a little bit more like my father, I did not have in mind the white hair and the limp. But that was Rabbi David Stern commenting on two of the outwardly signature features of his late dad. Let's hear what Rabbi Stern the younger has to say.
As of September 1st, each time I stand before you on Shabbat, I stand before you as a potential defendant in a lawsuit. That's true of me, of Rabbi Robbins and Cantor Glicken, of all of your clergy who at one time or another may counsel a member of this congregation wrestling with the excruciating spiritual and moral question of whether to terminate a pregnancy. Because on September 1st, something our state legislature had passed became official, SB 8. The law which makes abortion effectively illegal after about 6 weeks of pregnancy. And in a bizarre legal twist intended to protect the law from court challenge, empowers any citizen of this state who is not a government official to sue any other citizen who is in any way connected to an individual's choice to terminate a pregnancy. The doctor who provides the abortion, the landlord who owns the property where the clinic is, the family member or Uber driver who brings the woman to her appointment, the faith leader who provides a safe space for the woman to consider her options. The law includes a profit motive. If victorious, the plaintiff is guaranteed a minimum of $10,000. Any of us who stands up here leading you in prayer is a potential defendant, as are you, if you support a friend or family member in the face of this profoundly personal crisis. This is not hypothetical. This is not pending. This is the law of the land as we come together here tonight. And it effectively ends reproductive rights in our state, given that approximately 85% of all abortions here take place after the 6-week mark. The bill does create an exception if the mother's life is at risk, but not for cases of rape or incest. That is why abortion providers in states like Oklahoma and Kansas have seen a spike in Texas residents coming for abortions and other reproductive health services. One clinic in Kansas reports that over half of their total clientele now come to them from Texas. A clinic in Oklahoma reports over a 600% increase in Texas clients over the last 6 weeks. And that is just for the subset of women who have the physical or financial means to make the trip. SB 8 has made Interstate 35 the new trail of tears and of Texas shame. I've used the term about 6 weeks to refer to the point in fetal development after which the law's prohibitions take effect. The law does not actually refer to a set period of time, but rather to the point at which some measure of embryonic cardiac activity is detected in the cluster of cells which is not yet a heart. That, loosely termed, is the legislation's marker of the living status of the fetus, and it typically happens at about 6 weeks. But Judaism offers a different marker. You might remember that the core text in the Jewish tradition on the question of abortion comes from Exodus chapter 21, where we read this: "When men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life." In other words, if the fetus perishes, the penalty for the loss of the pregnancy is in the form of financial damages. But if the mother dies, the penalty is the penalty for murder. For 1,500 years, our tradition has concluded from this text and reams of subsequent commentary that fetal life is not equivalent to human life outside of the womb. Fetal life is potential life, but it is only realized once the potential life becomes actual, viable life outside of the womb. There's plenty of debate in Judaism related to different dimensions of the abortion question, but one thing is crystal clear: the mother's life always takes precedence over that of the fetus, and the fetus, while endowed with a measure of value and dignity, is not equivalent to a living, breathing being in the world. That is why Judaism not only permits abortion in some cases, but requires it in order to preserve the life and health of the mother.
Okay, so that is the excerpt from Rabbi Stern's sermon that I wanted to share with you. I apologize, I was informed that the volume is a little low from Rabbi Stern's speech. The volume was up as high as it goes on my computer. By a show of just thumbs up, can you hear me better? Good, I see those hands, thank you. So Rabbi Stern, as he always does when he orates, he brings, I think, a mastery of homiletics, the art of preaching, to a very complex conversation. He distills down in very few words an essential argument to be made. Our job here is actually to pick up where he leaves off. He refers to reams of subsequent commentary that reinforces the position of Exodus chapter 21, the text with which he begins, that suggests that fetal life, while living in a way, is not evaluated as the same as human life. It is not equivalent to. And therefore, that's actually not the end of the conversation. In Judaism, that's the beginning. So I'm going to bring some texts up on the screen. If you can't read them, don't worry. I will read them for you slowly and clearly. And were I with you in person, you'd have them in front of you, but this is how we make do in a world of COVID. So what I'm going to do is just pop up onto the screen my text source sheet. And that should enable us to take a look at where the conversation goes in the Jewish tradition from where Rabbi Stern led off. So looking at the text that he presented to us, when men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman, but no other damage ensues, and a miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him, the payment to be based on reckoning, but if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life. It is exactly as Rabbi Stern interpreted. This means that fetal life is not evaluated as the same as the life of the mother. Now, this point gets elaborated in subsequent texts. So we're going to jump forward. We're going to time travel away from the biblical source. And by the way, Exodus chapter 21 is widely regarded in the scholarly community as some of the oldest biblical material of all. So this material may be 3,000 years old, the biblical material. The Talmudic material may be as recent as 14 or 1,500 years old. So we're actually chopping the timeline in half. We're fast forwarding a millennium and a half to get to what the Talmud has to say here. And the Talmud, of course, is a keen observer of the biblical text, and the rabbis of the Talmud elaborated on their meaning, often unpacking the inherent complexities, challenges, and ambiguities. So in the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Chulin, which actually happens to be all about the proper ways to perform kosher slaughter, don't let that distract you, because the Talmud is highly discursive and digressive, which means it goes off on tangents. It says here the fetus is the thigh of its mother, which is a pretty odd phrase, because we know that of the many things a fetus may be, it is not the thigh of its mother. A separate Talmudic comment clarifies the matter. In Tractate Arachin, it says, for it, meaning the fetus, is her body. So the important thing is that this is a metaphor. The fetus is not the literal thigh of the mother. The fetus is like the mother's thigh or arm or nose or any other body part, in that the fetus is regarded as a body part. The fetus is actually not an independent organism in this rendering in the Talmud, but rather is part of the mother's body. Now, this isn't only meaningful from a Jewish perspective, it is arguable from a biological perspective, in that for much of its development, the zygote, the cluster of cells that is an embryo in formation, through the formation of an embryo, on to many, many weeks of fetal development, the organism in formation is not viable outside the womb. We know that biologically, even though medical intervention over the last, especially 25 years, has given increasing viability to babies that are born prematurely. So it used to be the case that a preemie born, say, at 27 weeks would be viable only in the most rare of circumstances. Nowadays, while not exactly routine, there is a reasonable expectation that a baby delivered at 27 weeks with medical intervention can often be viable. And that's a huge difference, but that has been made possible only in the last quarter of a century of medical science. Obviously, going back to Talmudic times, no such opportunities, no such medical intervention was available or possible. So for most of its development, a fetus in utero, and obviously a pre-fetal cluster of cells, call it an embryo or even before embryo a zygote, as medical science denotes, is not an independently viable being. So we have from, we're not necessarily going all in chronological order on these texts. So we're going to look at a text here from the Mishnah. Those of you who are studying Mishnah with me every Thursday morning, and by the way, it's never too late to join. We'll be doing more Mishnah classes over the summer and into the fall on Zoom, Thursdays at 10:15. Mishnah Arachin, the same section of the Mishnah that is later elaborated in Talmud Arachin. It says, in the case of a pregnant woman convicted of a capital crime, who goes forth to be executed, we do not wait for her to give birth. But if she had already sat on the birth stool, one waits for her until she gives birth. So here you have this admittedly unusual case, and probably a case that came up only extremely irregularly, at least I hope so. And the Talmud will later elaborate that the basic Jewish approach to capital punishment is to be as limiting and restrictive as possible. So much so that there's a line in the Talmud that says that a Jewish court that executes a convicted criminal once every 70 years is considered to be bloodthirsty. So the idea, obviously it's an exaggerated statement, but the idea is that Judaism in theory may permit capital punishment. It is well attested throughout the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, that capital punishment is a norm. In fact, it is referenced in the line from Exodus 21 about the case of the two men fighting that result in a miscarriage. It goes on to say, but if other damage ensues, read, if the woman perishes in the altercation between these two men, she gets caught up in the line of crossfire, as it were, and she dies, the penalty shall be life for life, which is a direct assessment of capital punishment. So capital punishment is all over the Bible, but by the time you get to the Talmud, it is considered highly irregular actually to impose it. And there are lots of reasons why, but Jews tended not to favor implementing capital punishment. Nevertheless, let's take the case before us, which is a woman who is guilty of a capital crime and who is about to be executed. The case here is that the woman is pregnant, and the rabbis determined that if she is pregnant, she is still executed unless, the phrase here is, she had already sat on the birth stool, which is just the rabbinic way of saying if she has already gone into labor. So once we're actually in the process of labor, it is now too late to execute the mother. Another life is at stake that is innocent of any crime. And it is clearly regarded that the fetus has a different status than it did before labor. Therefore, we do not execute. And the thing that I want to bring, you notice, by the way, that nothing we have looked at so far has used the word abortion. It is not that our ancient ancestors and the rabbinic community were unfamiliar with abortion. In fact, in 1 minute, we're going to see a text that makes it clear, crystal clear, that the rabbinic community was intimately familiar with the practice of abortion. Abortion as a medical practice, abortion has been practiced for thousands and thousands of years. Long before there were people who identified as Israelites, much less Jews, we know of civilizations practicing prenatal abortion. We also know of civilizations that practice postnatal child sacrifice. That is a different thing entirely. So the case here is brought to bear, even though it does not directly reference abortion, because it makes an important statement out of which we can draw an inference. And the inference is that something happens at labor. Something is different about the prenatal life form and the life form that is about to emerge into the world as no longer a fetus, but a baby. Hold that in mind because it is an essential groundwork text for where we go next. We're going to do a little bit of a detour, so I need you to bear with me. The sage Maimonides was the greatest of his generation. He lived in late 12th and early 13th century Spain, but soon found himself a forced migrant fleeing an extremist Muslim invasion, which is a bit of a long story, but they were brought in by the regime in Spain to fight off the Christians who were engaged in a program called Reconquista, which was the reclaiming of the Iberian Peninsula for the name of the crown and the Catholic Church. Out of which, by the way, out of which success, we have the very famous and also very intolerant regime of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella by the late 15th century. Maimonides flees, he goes to Fez in Morocco and eventually makes his way through North Africa, settling in Cairo. And I've actually visited the shul, the synagogue, where Maimonides kind of held court. Maimonides is such a great authority that his first name being Moses, the statement that is said about him is, from Moses to Moses, there was none like Moses. Mimoshe leMoshe ein k'Moshe. From the original Moses of the Torah to Moses Maimonides, no one arose who was like Moses. So he is on a level with the OG Moses, the original Moses. Maimonides has this to say about the case in front of us, or that will pertain to the case in front of us. He says, it is prohibited for a man to injure himself or his peer. One may not deliberately cause harm to oneself. By the way, this is an incredibly important text because it is brought to bear on everything from self-mutilation in a very direct way. If somebody asks me, God forbid, but this has actually happened in my rabbinate a number of times, Rabbi, I don't know what to do. We discovered that our teenage daughter is self-mutilating. She's cutting herself. What does Judaism say about this? Obviously, my first answer is not to quote Maimonides. It is to make sure that they are receiving the pastoral and psychological care that they need. And then if they want to talk Judaism, they can talk Judaism another day. But Maimonides makes it clear that deliberate self-harm goes against Jewish law. This would include, by the way, possible arguments against smoking cigarettes or partaking of other harmful, possibly controlled substances. If it is harmful to you, it is not Jewishly advised, and maybe even stronger, it is against halakha, Jewish law. I mention this law because it will become important for a number of reasons. One, because Maimonides has more to say on the subject of abortion in front of us today. And also, now we need to remember back to what the Talmud says about the fetus. If indeed the fetus is just part of the mother, and we have Maimonides saying that to harm oneself, to injure oneself knowingly goes against Judaism, one can begin to construct a Jewish argument that suggests that harming a fetus may not be so straightforward. It may not be always permissible. There may be reason enough to take a second look at the idea of abortion, even if the fetus is not an independent life form, even if the fetus is part of the mother. Because if we have another text that says it is forbidden for a person to injure himself or someone else, and the fetus is part of oneself, that doesn't mean that all of a sudden, just because a fetus is not an independent life form means that it's okay to abort. What I hope you will start to realize at this point in our talk is how complex the issue is going to be. And that if you're looking for some kind of rabbinic justification that concludes with, and therefore my rabbi taught me that Judaism says X about abortion, then you've misunderstood how this is going to go. Your rabbi is going to teach you a lot about abortion today, but it will not land on a unified single position. Now, having said that, and Sharon may have more to say about this, we can get to why most Jewish organizations and Jewish Americans are opposed to the recent leaked Supreme Court draft opinion suggesting that the right to abortion could be restricted and severely rolled back, and that all federal protection of the right to abortion be removed. It is a true statement that most American Jews and many, if not most, Jewish organizations in America oppose this direction, but it is not only a matter of Jewish law and text. Are you following? Good. Okay. It's a little bit harder when I'm not in the room where it's happening, but I can see your faces, even those of you who are wearing masks, and I see those eyes, and I'm getting that I'm not losing you. That makes me happy. Okay, so let us proceed. So we look at the next text. Now things get more sophisticated and subtle still. If she, meaning a woman, is found pregnant, the semen until the 40th day is only a mere fluid. If she's found, so a woman who turns up pregnant, the semen, obviously there is no semen left in the body on day 40 after impregnating a woman. But the point is that whatever mass of cells, which are pretty much like a few drops of fluid at day 40, it's very, very small, the organism that is growing inside of the womb. It is only mere fluid. So interestingly here, and 40, you always have to take the number 40 in Judaism with a grain of salt. 40 may mean literally 40, but in the case of Noah's Ark, 40 days and 40 nights, or Moses' duration on Mount Sinai, 40 days and 40 nights, or the length of year, the number of years that the Israelites wandered in the wilderness, 40. Sometimes 40 is just like after a while, after a long while. Or maybe it literally means at week 6 of pregnancy. And those who have been pregnant or have loved ones who have been pregnant or who know anything about pregnancy know that the diciest weeks of pregnancy, the most precarious weeks of carrying a life form inside, are the first 6 weeks. And it is not insignificant that the Texas law and others that are modeled after it, of which Rabbi Stern spoke in October, denotes 6 weeks as the point past which abortion will be made illegal or has been made illegal. And that has become a template for many other states. And in fact, should this draft opinion become an actual opinion and prevail, it is as many as 26 or even I hear 28 states that could either severely roll back or entirely deauthorize access to abortion in their states. That is a consequence that could result from what is currently before us in the public conversation, the public doings of the Supreme Court. 6 weeks. Now, the problem, as Rabbi Stern identified it, is a lot of women do not even know they are pregnant until after 6 weeks. The rabbis seem to corroborate that by suggesting that whatever is happening inside of the uterus at up to 40 days or approximately 6 weeks is just a blob. It is a little bit of fluid agglomerating inside of the woman, but it is in no way, shape, or form identified in Judaism as a life form of its own. And so we can proceed. So the next text takes us further. It says, he who indulges in marital intercourse, I love how it says that, he who has sex on the 90th day of pregnancy when it was thought to injure the embryo, that's an important bracketed comment that our gloss has provided, it is as though he had shed blood. All right, so this is where we have to distinguish between rabbinic Judaism and science. Fortunately for all of us, science has demonstrated that in most cases, there is nothing potentially injurious to a fetus about having sex even after the first trimester. Unless they are describing something improbably gymnastic, most medical authorities would say, sei gesund, go and have sex. But the rabbis, interestingly enough, have this belief, superstition. I do not know what evidence they have for this claim, but they hold a belief, maybe it's just what we call in Judaism, a baba maisa. Kind of old wives' tale, sorry to any of our women in the congregation. It's a misogynistic term, but it's one we embrace. Baba Maisa does not feel to me misogynistic. So it's a Baba Maisa that after 90 days, you shouldn't have sex with your wife who is pregnant. Why? Because maybe you will injure whatever is growing inside of her, the fetus. It doesn't say that. It doesn't talk about abortion, but something else emerges out of this text, which is relevant to the abortion conversation, which is that, if days 0 to 40, whatever is happening inside of the woman has one status, something different happens after day 90. Why day 90? We do not know, though it is interesting that that is the end of the first trimester. And if the 6 weeks, the first 6 weeks are the most precarious, certainly the first trimester is widely regarded as a time where, you know what, if you know you're pregnant, you only share with your nearest and dearest and your doctor. You don't go putting it on Facebook until after 12 weeks, after about 90 days. Why? Because God forbid, right? Maybe it's superstitious, but there's medicine, there's medical science to back this up. So all I want to point out is that it is not so simple as to say only when in labor do we have a different status assigned to the fetus. We see that there's a different status from day 0 to 40. There's a different status after day 90. And so we can proceed. So the next text is really the first time we actually have abortion. And it's a really old text. Mishnah. The Mishnah is a compilation of principles for living a Jewish life that are intended to be widely comprehensive, everything you need to know about living a Jewish life in every way, shape, or form, not just what you do in shul or what you do in the home, but also what you do in your place of business, how you practice agriculture, how you practice commerce, how you slaughter and eat food, how you deal with family relations. The Mishnah is all encompassing, and it is old. The Mishnah was redacted by the year 235 of the Common Era. So it is the better part of 1800 years old. In the Mishnah, it is written, if a woman has life-threatening difficulty in childbirth, one dismembers the embryo within her, limb by limb, because her life, meaning the life of the mother, takes precedence over its life. Once its head or its greater part, we'll talk about that, has emerged, it may not be touched, for we do not set aside one life for another. This is an extraordinarily consequential rabbinic teaching. And there's a lot in this very short text, which is the way of the Mishnah. It says a lot in very few words. Let's unpack it, because there are a number of conditions that must be met in order to act in the way it prescribes. If a woman has difficulty in childbirth, interestingly that the bracket puts life-threatening here, that is not actually in the text. It is the conventional interpretation of the text, but it is not actually in the Hebrew. If a woman has difficulty in childbirth, generally interpreted to mean difficulty that could threaten the mother's life, though the ambiguity around the word difficulty opens up other possibilities. Hold that in mind. If this happens, one dismembers. Now, again, must one? Not clear. May one? Absolutely. One may dismember the embryo, the life form, within her, limb by limb. There's a pretty gruesome description of how the actual abortion would take place. This is well before the so-called Plan B medical, drug option. So if you have life-threatening difficulty in childbirth, one dismembers, that's the mechanics of the abortion, limb by limb, because her life takes precedence over its life. So helpfully, and rabbinic writing doesn't always do this, it gives us the rationale. The reason is the life of the mother takes precedence over its life, meaning the life of the fetus. However, once its, meaning the fetus's head, has emerged, and it puts, this is not a bracket, this is parenthesis, which means that is in the Hebrew, or its greater part, that's for a child born breech, right? So if the delivery is regular, normal vaginal delivery, the head comes out, it's a living thing of its own. You cannot abort once the head is out. Or if born breech, if it is coming out feet first or otherwise, its greater part. What does that mean? I don't know, middle of the torso. I'm not the fortunately never have been asked to weigh in on that question. So basically, once the child is very clearly being born, you can't lay a finger on it, for we do not set aside one life for another. That's a very important core Jewish principle. That yes, saving life is paramount in Jewish tradition. We call that principle pikuach nefesh. It has been the #1 guiding axiom for how WRT has thought about its COVID policies. Before and above everything else comes pikuach nefesh. The requirement in Judaism to save a life is always first. There are 3 exceptions to that I'm not going to get into. Almost always, when able, you save a life, but you may not take a life to save a life. That's murder. So you may not take another innocent life to spare one in an equal exchange if the fetus is already out into the world, as it were, or mostly out into the world, it has independent status, and then to abort the fetus would be murder. Okay, this enables us to go on from here. Now, fortunately, the Mishnah is only a way station on a way to a modern full understanding of what Judaism says about abortion. Rashi, who up there with Maimonides is surely among the greatest interpreters of Torah, has a comment that is actually coming from the later Talmud, but clearly references the doctrine that we just read from the Mishnah. In other words, what Rashi is going to prove to us, writing as he was in the late 11th and early 12th centuries, a century before Maimonides effectively, what Rashi is going to demonstrate is how deeply ingrained the Mishnah that we just read, the principles within it about we do not set aside one life for another, the head or the greater part of the body having emerged is the sign that this is no longer a fetus, but a baby, a child, a person, and that the difficulty in childbirth is the presenting condition that warrants an abortion in the first place. All of this is now assumed knowledge by Rashi. Understand? So by the time you get, again, we've jumped 800 years in the future. They're doing a lot of time travel here. Rashi is basing his judgment here on 800 years of precedent and more, of course, going back to the Torah even before the Mishnah. So here's what Rashi has to say on the matter. He says, as long as the child did not come out into the world, it is not called a living being, and it is therefore permissible. You notice that it sounds like he's just repeating what we already know, but he's not. He's clarifying what we already know. It is therefore permissible to take its life in order to save the life of its mother. Once the head of the child has come out, the child may not be harmed because it is considered as fully born, and one life may not be taken to save another. So Rashi is not only repeating what we already know, he is clarifying its meaning. He gives us the reasons behind it. He says, first and foremost, one does not set aside one life to save another, okay? He affirms that it is the head of the child. He does not mention the greater part of the body if born breech, but that is assumed. And very importantly, he includes two conditions that are more ambiguous in the Mishnah that he makes more concrete here. One, that we are doing this abortion in order to save the life of the mother. You'll recall that in the Mishnah, the ambiguous word is if she has difficulty in childbirth, which may or may not mean life-threatening difficulty, even though that is how it has conventionally been interpreted. That's one. Two, Rashi goes so far as to say that it is permissible to take its life in order to save the life of the mother. But is it required? There is a difference between something being allowed and something being mandated. And to know more about that, we now go back to Maimonides. So here's what Maimonides says in a very interesting passage that I'm going to hold up as a opposing or counterpoint to the Rashi way of looking at abortion. Here's what Maimonides says. Notice first and foremost, if you can read it, where in Maimonides' magnum opus, the Mishnah Torah, literally the second Torah, Maimonides had high regard for his own work as a scholar. In the Mishnah Torah, this is in the section called Laws of Murder. Please keep that in mind. That is not insignificant. The sages have ruled that when a woman has difficulty giving birth, one may dismember the child in her womb. Notice something that Maimonides adds here, either with drugs or by surgery. Now, the Mishnah didn't say with drugs, but by the time you get to Maimonides, 1,000 years after the Mishnah was written, he is aware of certain things that you might be able to ingest that would terminate a pregnancy. Should we trust Maimonides on this? I think so, because he was a medical doctor. Should we trust him the way we would trust a 21st century medical doctor? Definitely not. He was a medical doctor in Spain in the 1200s. Nevertheless, he was a physician and widely regarded as a brilliant one at that. So he says one may perform an abortion either with drugs or by surgery because, now here's a very different way through the rabbinic reasoning. Pay attention. Because he, meaning the fetus, is like a pursuer seeking to kill her, the mother. We're going to come back to that line. He is like a pursuer seeking to kill her. Once his head has emerged, he may not be touched, for we do not set aside one life for another. All right, so the end part is clear. The beginning part is clear. The business about drugs is interesting. Drugs or surgery are acceptable mechanisms for performing the abortion in Maimonides' view. Life-threatening difficulty to the mother is a given. None of this has yet touched on rape, incest, congenital deformity, or any other financial inability to care for the child, emotional or mental inability to care for the child, lack of family support, lack of community support. There are countless reasons why a woman might choose to seek an abortion. The only one that is in conversation right now is life-threatening, the mother's life is threatened. And possibly the fact that difficulty in childbirth, the ambiguity of that phrase may open up other permissible, other conditions in which abortion is permissible, even if it is not mandated. All that is fairly apparent from Maimonides, but there's a hard phrase too. He says, the fetus is like a pursuer seeking the life of the mother. This is a rabbinic argument that seems to come out of nowhere. It does not come out of nowhere. It's just that we didn't look at anything that set us up to expect it. Let me explain. Suppose Fran Siegel, sorry, Fran, I love you, but I'm going to use you as an example. Suppose Fran is a hardened criminal who is chasing after, let's say Carol Prinzer-Levy with a weapon. Fran's got a gun. For whatever reason, Carol has really ticked her off, and Fran is out to get Carol. Are you with me on the scenario here? This is fiction. Fran is after Carol with a gun. A third-party bystander, Raina Alperstein, comes along. I don't even know if these people are here in the room with us. I'm going to assume that some of you are. Comes along and sees what's unfolding. If Raina is in a position to apprehend Fran with her gun chasing after Carol, she not only may do so, she must. If a third party's life is not in danger, but sees a pursuer, that's the term here. The case in Hebrew is known as the case of the rodef, which means the pursuer, the one who is chasing after, seeking to harm the life of another. It is obligatory in Judaism to apprehend the pursuer. Now, does everybody understand the case, at least with Carol, Raina, and Fran? All right, so now that's the case law that Maimonides is deploying in understanding abortion. He is not saying we should abort because the mother's life is in danger and we do not set aside one life for another and the mother's life is in danger. That is not the reason. The reason Maimonides argues, and this is very sophisticated rabbinic logic, is that the fetus is jeopardizing the mother's life. The same way, it's as if the fetus has a gun pointed to the mother's head. And therefore, it is not only permissible to abort, it is required. Everyone following? If you are able to abort a fetus that, as it were, has a gun to the head of the mother, you abort. There is, however, a byproduct or a side product of this line of rabbinical reasoning. For if you argue that the fetus is a pursuer with a gun to the head of the mother, as it were, and must be terminated, not may be terminated, but must be terminated, you have automatically assigned to the fetus something that is normally associated only with independent living beings. So you have inadvertently, through this, Maimonides, through this argument, has inadvertently, or perhaps advertently, made the case that the fetus is an independent being. And the reason we terminate it is not because we can, not because it lacks the status of an independent being, but actually because it is an independent being, and it is an independent being that, like the pursuer, is threatening the life of the mother. These two lines of reasoning, we may abort or we must abort, the fetus is not an independent being, the fetus is an independent being acting as a pursuer, lead to two different interpretations, even up to the present day, about when and how abortion may be permissible. So I'm going to share with you one of the most famous cases from the 20th century. So we're jumping another 800 years in the future, but I know you are very sophisticated learners, you're following me. So Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, who was the chief rabbi of Shaarei Tzedek Hospital in Jerusalem, this is decades old now, but he wrote, with regard to an abortion because of the Tay-Sachs disease. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Tay-Sachs. It is a congenital abnormality that leads to malformation of the pulmonary system and inevitably results in the death of the child before the age of 5. There are no Tay-Sachs adults. Tay-Sachs children all die. By the way, the Jewish community in the Haredi world, the ultra-Orthodox world, has all but eliminated Tay-Sachs by doing genetic screening and not permitting matches to be made for husbands and wives when they are both carriers of the Tay-Sachs genetic abnormality. But suppose you learn, God forbid, that the child that you are carrying is a Tay-Sachs baby. The fetus has the abnormality, has the genetic malformation that leads to Tay-Sachs. In this case, in which the consequences are so grave that the pregnancy and childbirth are allowed to continue, it is permissible to terminate the pregnancy up until 7 months have elapsed, and in a way in which no danger will befall the mother. So in other words, if you can safely do it, even at 7 months, then you should. Beyond 7 months, the issue is more serious. He doesn't say it's impermissible, but he says it's more serious since at the end of 7 months, the fetus is often fully developed. So that, and it goes on from there. It's a sophisticated text where we don't need to read all of it. That is the opinion of one very well-respected exponent of Jewish law and practice, who I don't think is still alive, but only recently. I want you to see what happens in the Jewish community. And these are all Orthodox authorities weighing in on these matters. So not long after, we have Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who writes, "I was appalled by the responsa of a learned man in Israel who permits the abortion of a Tay-Sachs fetus even beyond 3 months. It is clear and simple, as I wrote the law, which is made clear by the early rabbis and the arbiters of Jewish law." You know, it says, I wrote he didn't write the halakha, he wrote the authoritative opinion in recent memory about abortion. So here we have a real locking of horns, a real dispute between two 20th century rabbis on this matter. He says, abortion is prohibited as it is considered actual murder, whether the fetus is pure or illegitimate, meaning doesn't matter whether the fetus was born in the context of a happy, loving marriage or through rape or incest, God forbid. Regular fetuses or those which are suffering from Tay-Sachs, doesn't matter if the fetus is, developmentally and neurologically typical or not neuro and developmentally typical, suffering from a terrible disorder like Tay-Sachs, that it is strictly prohibited, and we do not err. He is counseling his followers, do not err and rely on the responsa of that. He will give credit to his colleague, learned man. He may be learned, but he is wrong. And this is extraordinarily consequential. So it is not the case that Judaism has a highly permissive attitude toward abortion. It does not. The cases in which abortion is permitted tend to be very limited, around life-threatening harm to the mother. Even something as severe as Tay-Sachs, again, in the Orthodox community, has divided the authorities. Having said that, a majority of the world's Jews are not Orthodox. A majority of the world's Jews are non-Orthodox in one way, shape, or form. You among them. And that is why, especially in America, the attitudes of the Jewish community, that isn't why, but this is in conversation with the fact that in America, most Jews and most Jewish communities and most Jewish organizations have a problem with restricting access to abortion on principle, because the ideas that inform the legislation tend to be rooted in a non-Jewish understanding of religious values. It is a Catholic and later an evangelical Christian idea that life begins at conception, and that even from the moment that the egg is fertilized, it has independent status. That is not an idea that has any place in Judaism whatsoever. And so it is already problematic for Jews and Jewish communities to feel comfortable with legislation that begins with that as its starting point understanding. There have been, of course, many further, much more detailed and specific case laws in Judaism and outside of orthodoxy that take up this very question. I will share just one bit. I will ask Sharon to chime in, and then we may have time for a little bit of Q&A, just so you know where we are in the course of our discussion today. We're nearing the end. So the Central Conference of American Rabbis is again, the organizing body of Reform rabbis. I am a card-carrying member, and I actually co-chair the annual giving fund for the CCAR. If you'd like to support our rabbinic organization, we rely on the support not just of our members, our fellow rabbis, but also on friends of our members, members of congregations like ours who believe that a strong rabbinic network is good for the Jews. The CCAR has a committee called the Responsa Committee. The Responsa Committee fields questions pertaining to matters of Jewish law and practice. I don't think I'm mistaken that Rabbi Levy, perhaps not right now, but has for several years served on the Responsa Committee of Reform Judaism, and is one of the rabbis entrusted with evaluating challenging new cases of Jewish law and practice that may arise based on evolving circumstances, right? I mean, everything from our synagogue burned down. Are we allowed to pray in a church that has a crucifix at the front of the room? Well, you don't know until you ask. And there's not an answer in the Torah, so the rabbis have to go back through reams and reams of Jewish law and commentary. On the case of abortion, there are reams and reams of Jewish commentary. One such commentary I'll just summarize here. And the commentary here is interesting because it summarizes and acknowledges both the Rashi argument of it is permissible to abort because a fetus is not an independent life form, and it is required to abort, the Maimonides opinion, because the fetus is like an independent life form that has a gun to the head of the mother. It's acting like the pursuer. It says here, some recent scholars have felt that only the argument of pursuit, gun to the head, provides the proper basis for abortion, and only when the mother's life is endangered. And they go into the reasoning behind that. On the other hand, a different line of reasoning, which dealt with the mother's psychological state, is based on the earlier Mishnah passage that we looked at from Arachim. It would permit abortion for such reasons, such as the mother's psychological state, or even because of the anguish that would be caused to the mother by a child's potential deformity or other problems. So there are Orthodox halachic authorities, Jewish legal authorities, who permit abortion when, for instance, it is detected neonatally that deafness is indicated, that the fetus does not hear. Another halachic authority permits abortion when rubella occurs in the mother in early pregnancy. We've seen the one from Eliezer Waldenberg, which does so for Tay-Sachs disease and includes other serious abnormalities. Some rabbis are reluctant to permit abortion at all, going back to the grounds that one may not inflict a wound on oneself, and if the fetus is part of the mother, then abortion should not be permitted. And so what I'm going to say here by way of stopping with text and moving to inviting you to join, I'm going to ask Sharon to speak next, is I hope you will have a deep appreciation for how complicated the issue is. And if, as is the case, Jews in large measure in America oppose abortion, it is rooted in religious conviction to some extent, but that is only the beginning of it. A lot of it simply tracks with the way that Jews tend to vote. And whether the candidates are Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, or Joe Biden and Donald Trump, or Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, 70 to 75% of American Jews tend to vote for the Democratic candidate. That it has nothing to do, I shouldn't say nothing, it has very little to do with religious conviction or familiarity with Jewish law. It has to do with American Jews tend to be on the more liberal side. And there are all sorts of sociological, you can call them anthropological forces that inform that. Jews have benefited, I would add here though, from a strong upholding of the separation of church and state in America. And therefore, Jews tend to get anxious or nervous or reluctant when they see that the government seems to be infringing religious freedoms. And in as much as the leaked decision of the Supreme Court the leaked opinion of the Supreme Court, should it become an actual decision, appears to marginalize the Jewish perspective on abortion, that in and of itself is anathema to a majority of American Jews. So I don't want to leave out Judaism from the way Jews think and vote and are responding to what's happening vis-a-vis Roe v. Wade. I just don't want it to make Judaism, I don't want to oversimplify and say, Judaism supports abortion, end of story, let's go march. If we shall march, if we shall print out of principle and thought and our own Jewish conviction, choose to oppose the undoing of Roe v. Wade, let us do so with a very deep and substantial awareness of what Judaism says about the issue and also what Judaism does not say about the issue. And on that, I'm going to conclude my remarks with gratitude to all of you for being such great listeners. I hope you've been engaged with this. A little bit tricky doing this from my home. Sharon, do you want to chime in here? I assume you're still with us. You've just gone off camera.
Hi, I am here. I just want to say thank you so much. I found that extremely fascinating. I knew maybe 1/8 of what you talked about, and it really, I will say you could be a lawyer, the way you take apart that text. You know, I feel very strongly that we are here to talk about it from a Jewish context. We are in or streaming into a synagogue. I do want to just share for those who haven't had the opportunity to really look at the decision and think about what those real life consequences might be, just to give maybe 2 minutes on that. Rabbi Blake mentioned that there are between 26 and 28 states that in some way or another will make abortion illegal. Now that is in different forms. That could come from the fact that by the decision of Roe v. Wade being, when that came down, there were laws on the books already existed that were found to be unconstitutional. So once Roe v. Wade is found, is overturned, those could actually be basically revived by the fact that what found them to be unconstitutional is now unconstitutional. There are also other states that have what are called trigger laws. They have enacted laws that say if and when we're able to ban abortion, we will, to put it in the simplest terms. So once Roe v. Wade is overturned, those trigger laws get triggered immediately and abortion will be illegal. But what this specific decision did was it really attacks, and if it's filed in this way, what makes me concerned on top of abortion rights is that it attacks the idea that we have a right to privacy inherent in our Constitution. It leaves open a roadmap to undo other precedent. And I apologize, I don't actually have the decision in front of me right now, but there is language to the effect that this court is able to undo decisions that were made erroneously. And so the question then comes, what will they look at next? And I don't think that that is a fear-mongering approach. I think that's just reading what was written by Justice Alito, and I think he writes purposefully. The other thing I just want to highlight for those who haven't had the opportunity to look at it, and what Rabbi Blake and I pointed out in our letter to the congregation, is that this decision relies on laws that all were enacted prior to a woman even having a right to vote, except for one, which really tells you what the opinion of this court is of a woman's voice. And throughout the decision, Justice Alito acknowledges that women have access to the legislative, to fight legislation, to vote, to have access to maternity leave and so forth. But by relying on laws that do not that were enacted prior to the women's right to vote is really a telling moment. And the other point I just want to bring up is Rabbi Blake referred to laws at 6 weeks, but there are some states such as Louisiana that are recommending legislation at this point that says at the point of fertilization of the egg,
Yep.
it would be banned. That it gives the way specifically the Louisiana law reads is it gives personhood to a fertilized egg, putting a fertilized egg on the same level as a woman. And as of a human, with which we all know now, nowhere in our religion would that be true. Right. And it also starts to question things like IVF.
And
which
even
is
things.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please finish your sentence.
No, so I was just gonna say it starts to question things like IVF, what happens to unused embryos,
right,
and whatnot. So it really, there is a slippery slope here.
And even proposed legislation that in some states may criminalize abortion and make the woman subject to criminal investigation or conviction penalty, in my view, run so completely counter to everything we've seen today, right? So there's still, again, I'm not a lawyer, and I was so impressed, Sharon, when the draft opinion came down. I think within 48 hours, within 24 hours, you touched base with me, and the first thing you said is, have you read the opinion? And of course, I said, no, not yet. He said, oh, I've read all 68 pages. I said, okay, so you're the authority here. However, there was nothing in the tradition that we've looked at that would suggest that abortion is anything other than healthcare for the mother. The framework is what provides the cognitive dissonance that Jews should feel about what's happening at the Supreme Court level right now. And obviously, you know, it doesn't mean that abortion will cease to be possible in America. It means that there will not be a federal protection for it. There will not be a federal guarantee that it is a woman's right to choose to have an abortion. And in some cases, states will restrict it partially or even entirely. And our country will become further balkanized into blue and red. And as you have pointed out, as we have pointed out in our communication with the congregation, women of color, women who live below the poverty line, women who are in abusive relationships, women who are already on the most vulnerable edges of society will be the ones to suffer disproportionately in this turn of events. So thank you so much, Sharon. Stay with us because people may have questions that you'd be better at answering than I can. We have only a little bit of time for questions and I won't be able to hear you. So maybe Idan or somebody else could be the designated spokesperson, approach the computer and ask. If we have like one or two good questions, I'd be willing to take them.
Well, we could probably just unmute the computer. But I don't know, I'm not a good person to moderate this.
Right. Anyone? I mean, or what you can do is you can also follow up with me afterward. It's not the same interactive format that I would have loved, but allow me then simply to say thank you. I regard it as an incredible privilege to be with you. I regard it as a privilege to work with incredible, talented colleagues like Sharon, only the newest member of the senior staff of WRT, but already making such an impact, such a difference. Sharon, it's great to have you join for this talk this afternoon. To the leadership of the WRJ, current, forthcoming, and for all that you do to sustain, support, and enrich the fabric of Westchester Reform Temple through social connection, through learning, through activism, through prayer, through spiritual development, through everything that you do for WRT, please know how grateful I am. And I do hope that even if I have to keep my distance tomorrow night, I'll be able to greet you at a beautiful service of tribute to Rabbis Levy and Reeser. I do hope you'll join us. The intention is to be outside. I just can't wait to have more occasions when I don't have to be sitting in my living room talking to you from a remove like this. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.